Statements from Don Cherry on Saturday nights. But this week, Cherry went beyond the ice and into the locker room, commenting on who shouldn't be in there. Kurt Petrovich reports on what he said and the reaction.
Hey, Stanley Cup playoffs start Tuesday, Don.
But I want to say something, first of all.
It isn't the first time Don Cherry's been controversial.
I don't believe, and I really believe this, I don't believe women should be in the male dressing room.
To the chagrin of his screen partner, Ron McLean.
You believe women should be...
Of course, Don. Like in any job, equal opportunity.
Well, in equal opportunity, then why aren't men in women's dressing room?
Well, they should be.
What lit Cherry's fuse was a comment last week by Chicago Blackhawks defenseman Duncan Keith to a female reporter. Some felt he took a swipe at her gender.
I don't feel women are equal. I feel they're above us. And I think they're on a pedestal, and they should not be walking in when naked guys are walking in.
Predictably, social media lit up with condemnation, labeling Cherry a bonehead. A rare few sided with the 79-year-old former coach, doubling down. Don Cherry is right, and sadly the feminists are trying to silence him. But some hockey fans say Cherry was offside.
As a father of a 7-year-old daughter, I want her to be able to do whatever profession she wants to do. And if that includes being in the dressing room to do her job, then she should be able to do it.
Some who are doing it don't understand the uproar.
I didn't take it personally. I just kind of smiled a bit and went, oh, Don.
This sports journalist says no reporters are ever admitted to private dressing rooms where players might be indecent.
I would say to them, I think you're taking this far too seriously, and you're kind of missing the shtick that Don Cherry has become.
Shtick or not, Cherry's view was enough for the CBC to issue a statement that he speaks for himself and not the CBC, adding that co-host McLean had the opposing view, which gave balance to the discussion.
In its own statement, the Association for Women in Sports Media labeled Cherry's comments sexist and outdated, pointing out that women have been in NHL locker rooms for nearly 40 years. Kurt Petrovich, CBC News, Vancouver.
In British Columbia, it's just over 2 weeks until the province's election. And while the latest polls suggest the NDP is poised to govern for the first time in 12 years, the Green Party is hoping for a breakthrough. To achieve it, it's turned to some star power, a world-renowned expert on global warming with ideas of changing the province's political climate. Chris Brown has more from Victoria for us. Chris.
Wendy, for a lot of people, winning a Nobel Prize would be a career topper. Not Andrew Weaver. If a green wave sweeps the city of Victoria on BC's election day, Andrew Weaver may be riding the crest of it. He's a world-renowned scientist who's decided the time for study is over.
I think I felt a responsibility to actually get engaged, because by doing so, I feel that it's the final thing a scientist can do.
Weaver is something of a climate change superstar. His forecasting and dire warnings, published in a key UN report in 2007, contributed to a Nobel Prize.
I present to you this fossil award.
He's called Stephen Harper's government one of the most climate-unfriendly governments anywhere.
We don't have to have, Greenland being committed to melting. We don't have to have a committed extinction of half the world's species. We don't have to have the elimination or the extinction of all the world's corals if we actually start to deal with this problem.
That means transitioning from fossil fuels to renewables and opposing any project, especially oil pipelines, that could increase production of the oil sands. He'd even freeze BC's involvement in natural gas, which the other parties have embraced as a path to prosperity.
My name's Andrew Weaver. I'm with the Green Party of British Columbia.
We got your name on our lawn.
And yet, the chance that Weaver will make it into government to implement his ideas is virtually nil. BC's Greens have never won a seat in the BC legislature. Instead, Weaver sees himself as a provincial version of Elizabeth May, the history-making first-ever Green MP whose riding overlaps his.
So I would argue that Elizabeth May, as one individual, has far more influence than 100 Tory backbenchers.
For those in the environmental movement, Weaver's Green candidacy has created a conundrum. He's a hero to many, including Sephora Berman, but she's voting NDP.
I think it's really important that people vote for a government that is going to help protect our coast over the next 4 years, and that is clearly an NDP government, and that's why I've made this choice.
Ironically, it's the governing BC Liberals who have arguably gone further than any government in Canada in this area by bringing in a carbon tax, and that's what Weaver's opponent says she'll campaign on.
It's not one or the other. You can have a strong economy, you can have a sustainable environment.
Rather than spreading their limited resources all around the province, the Greens are focusing on Weaver's riding here in Victoria and others nearby. The prospect of a cluster of MLAs and a federal MP is tantalizing. Wendy.
Thanks so much, Chris. Chris Brown. And British Columbians go to the polls on May 14th. CBC is offering a new edition of Vote Compass. You answer a short series of questions and get a sense of how the party's policies compare with your views. It's easy to do, and you can find it at cbcnews.ca/votecompass. Rock stars and movie stars were out last night at the White House Media Correspondents' Dinner, but the star of the show was Barack Obama.
I know CNN has taken some knocks lately, but the fact is I admire their commitment to cover all sides of a story, just in case one of them happens to be accurate.
The president did make fun of himself, too.
I understand second term, need a burst of new energy, try some new things, and then my team and I talked about it. We were willing to try anything, so we borrowed one of Michelle's tricks. I thought this looked pretty good.
Some Canadians were in the audience, too. There's our ambassador to the U.S., Gary Dewar, and the CBC's Susan Bonner and Neil MacDonald. There he is. Hi, Neil. The events of recent weeks have made it impossible for Canadians to turn a blind eye to the threat of radicalism. Coming up, a special 3 to Watch looks at how that threat has changed and in some ways become harder to detect. Plus, how young Canadians can be lured by jihadist ideas, the signs that could tip you off that it's happening to someone you know, and what it takes to bring them back. That's next on The National.
The RCMP is alleging that Shihab Esagayr and Raid Jasser were conspiring to carry out an al-Qaeda-supported attack against a Via passenger train.
Tonight, a special 3 to Watch. On Monday, police made 2 arrests in an alleged plot to bomb a train inside Canada. As the threats, the shocks keep coming, we'll look at how these young men get recruited, how they get radicalized, and whether we're equipped to deal with it. But first, a recap of recent events that affect us all. The 9/11 attack in New York City changed Canada's approach to terror threats, bringing heightened awareness and tightened border security. In 2006, police arrested the Toronto 18, foiling a plan to bomb the Toronto Stock Exchange and other buildings and storm Parliament. When Osama bin Laden was killed, papers found near him referred to Canada as a possible target. Earlier, the CN Tower had been mentioned. This January, 2 Canadians helped lead an attack that killed dozens at an Algerian gas plant. And just this week, police arrested 2 men in an alleged terrorist plot against Via Rail. And our special 3 to Watch panelists. Ray Boisvert is the former assistant director of CSIS. Mubin Sheikh was the undercover CSIS agent who infiltrated the Toronto 18 and now an expert in how these young men get radicalized. Mohammed Robert Heft converted to Islam as a younger man. He runs de-radicalization programs for young people in Toronto. So, time for our topic number 1, the changing face of Canada's terror threat. Officials in both the U.S. and Canada have described the most recent incidents as the work of amateurs. Vice President Joe Biden mocked the Boston bombing brothers.
2 twisted, perverted, cowardly knockoff jihadis.
And earlier this year, the head of CSIS clearly warned about the trend of lone wolf terror threats.
I think the threat remains roughly at the same level. It is morphed, though, into something that's harder to get your hands on.
So is Canada prepared, Ray, for this literally all over the map threat?
I think Wendy was prepared as we were about a minute ago, and that's part of the challenge. As Director Fadden mentioned himself, things are transforming by the minute, and the nature of the threat has changed from what we saw in the early 90s, where we saw conflict zones that produced or attracted a number of jihadists, moving into a place of or a space where around 9/11 people were being centrally directed, controlled, trained, and so on. Not to overstate it, it's still quite amorphous, to finding something that I like to refer to increasingly as sort of a globalized jihadist approach, and where individuals are becoming self-radicalized or becoming radicalized through others and are finding a way towards a passion or a way to express their sense of violence. The challenge for authorities, though, is to get it right. The data is very, very difficult. It's amorphous, and we're going to have to come up with some very modern tools to help manage it.
So, Mubin, is Canada, are Canadians prepared?
I don't think the Canadian public is prepared. I think we still have a very idealistic perception of the world, idealistic perception of Canadians in general. And I think it's time that this kind of discussion leads us into more into a state of awareness.
Do you think that the enforcement people are clued in?
They're starting to learn. They're at the business end of the stick, if you will, and so they are forced to adapt. They have no choice. They must adapt to the threat.
And this time, Mohammed, it was a Toronto or an imam in the community who basically brought these fears to authorities. Are we prepared? Is the system working better?
I'm an eternal optimist, so I would like to believe that we're better prepared. I definitely think that from this week, it shows that the Muslim community is becoming more and more informed, and the trust, which is so important, is being built. So. But I'm a realist as well, and I think that as we evolve as a community, as Canadians, terrorism will evolve. So we can be as prepared as we can be, but at the end of the day, we're probably not going to be able to stop everyone.
And you've been talking all weekend to people in the community. Is there a fear that this could actually drive people underground, knowing that there's so much communication now?
I think that's fair. I think as we get out there as community leaders and we're actually preaching more and more against it in our Friday sermons and to the community at large, you may see that. But at the end of the day, you know, like I said, you're not going to stop everyone, but at least if we're on the front lines and the Canadians know that we're there and, you know, we're trying to be part of the solution, not part of the problem, then we can try our best and leave the rest to God.
Time now for our second topic, which is how do these young men get recruited? As officials try to understand what drives young men towards active terrorism, one focus is the large cache of jihadi propaganda on the internet.
لا يحتاج إلى فتوى، لا يحتاج إلى مشورة، لا يحتاج إلى استخارة. هم حزب الشيطان، قتالهم هو فريضة الوقت. وصلنا وإياهم.
American Anwar al-Awlaki was a senior recruiter for al-Qaeda. He was killed by a 2011 drone strike in Yemen, but his messages, and others like it, remain popular among extremists. So, Mubin, I'll start with you on this. What is the appeal in videos like that and others that make the round on the obviously, if you're in your 20s, you're going to be on the internet. That's where you're going to be influenced. How do people reaching out to them, what do they know works?
Well, the grievance narrative is the single narrative that has the most traction. It's the idea that the West is engaged in a battle with Islam. And I've said this before, that those who perpetuate this narrative, that we are involved in a war against Islam, are actually aiding and abetting the adversary. So we have extremists on both sides perpetuating the same narrative. When you put in videos of people suffering, people being killed, and then you're showing them young kids who are already angry at the world, already have a very anti-authority position, it's very easy for them to then drop the message that, okay, now this is what you have to do. And you can see from the completely un-Islamic position of you don't need to consult scholars and you don't need to consult the Islamic sources, this is completely unheard of in Islamic sources. So for the people to be attracted to it and following this, it tells you that this is less Islamic, it is more something social.
What's the most dangerous appeal, Mohammed Radar?
I guess the fact that it's so easy. You don't have to be a scholar. You don't have to work hard. You don't have to study your religion. You instantly become creditable because you buy into a narrative that I'm going to go fight against the big devil, and it's very simple. It doesn't take a lot of education, doesn't take a lot of effort, and at the end of the day, it's appealing to people who are emotionally driven, sometimes with mental health issues, and people, quite honestly, who have real mixed up pasts.
What do you see, Ray?
Yeah, it definitely is a question of a form of abuse in a lot of ways. People have preyed on others, and it's easy to purvey those messages of fear and hate. It's part of this sort of a conspiracy theory thing we were chatting about earlier. This is a big element that's hard to defeat. So ultimately, though, we're going to have to come down to this point where community-level activities and people who speak out and denounce those who are purveying hate. And in fact, they should be perhaps face charges at some point because it is divisive and it's having such a negative effect on our society. So far, everybody's remained relatively calm. I think the best story that's come out of the last few days, it's the way Canadians have reacted to this thing. And I think that in itself speaks volumes.
So, Mubin, you were actually, when some of this was happening, you were in the States, you were helping counsel the FBI on issues like this. What is it that moves someone who is intrigued or attracted by extremism to an act of violence? And what do you watch for?
What you're going to look for is a cluster of activity. You're not just really going to look for one thing. Overtly dressing Islamically is not an indicator for terrorism. But if you join that with other behaviors, such as contact with known recruiters and extremists, participating in paramilitary operations, having an intensity of exclusivity in your activities where you conduct reconnaissance, intelligence, counterintelligence. When there's a cluster of behaviors, then you can start to see that perhaps now this person is moving towards action.
What sets off alarm bells for you, Mohammed Rao?
I don't know. I like to simplify it a little bit more for the viewers, but the bottom line is they like guns, they don't like authority. They come into the religion or start practicing it, and at the end of the day, it's like, wow, what a great narrative. I knew they were all wrong. And, I mean, you put those guys with a simplified version of Islam who already hate authority, want to be something, and are criminal. A lot of them are drug dealers. A lot of the people have been arrested.
Members.
Yeah, there's a big gap in their lives, essentially, and this fills that significant gap.
Yeah, instant credibility, I'm telling you, in the name of God. Like, keep that in mind. Stealing, lying, cheating, all things that anybody transcending religion, they don't, believe it's ungodly. But these guys, no, they're doing it and getting rewarded by God.
We're going to move on now to topic number 3, which is what can be done about this, de-radicalization. One very noticeable feature of this week's arrest announcement in Ottawa was the attendance of high-profile Muslim leaders.
This particular arrest was first, the genesis of it came from a tip within the Muslim community.
Asking for that kind of help has become a big part of Canada's anti-terror strategy. Police, religious and community groups are joining forces. Still, can at-risk young people be de-radicalized? So, Ray, back to you on this. Can they be de-radicalized?
With significant challenges, no doubt, because, of course, those who try to reach out to them are initially seen with suspicion. Even these fine gentlemen have great credentials and have been heavily involved in community-level activities and can speak extremely eloquently about the complexities of the issue. There's already a sort of a standoff point. I've visited Saudi Arabia. I've seen the de-radicalization center, the Prince bin Nayef piece. It's successful because they spend gobs of money on people. In fact, they call them beneficiaries, not inmates. So it involves finding a job, a spouse, getting settled, and there's a lot of follow-up. But the levels of recidivism are still important, and I think we'll have to consider new ways of doing it.
There's repeat offenders in this?
There are, for sure. There are lapses, like any other challenging ideological thing. In the UK and France as well, they've had great challenges. So getting them to the prison system is one thing. What do we do after?
What do? You actually do this with young people, Mohammed Rao.
Well, if I see that they're simplifying their religion too much, then I challenge. For example, they follow a translation of God knows whose translation of the Quran and the prophetic tradition. So what happens at the end of the day? You challenge them and say, well, what's the biography of the guy who wrote those supposed sayings from the prophet, peace be upon him? They don't know. They don't have an answer. You have to challenge their understanding of God, their understanding of jihad, their understanding of the religion in general, and you have to put doubt in them. And as soon as you put doubt in them, they'll come back to you, and slowly you break down. It's not 1 to 10, and there's 3 steps. It's 3 components. It's theological detox, there's social services, and there's community accountability, helping them integrate in society and participate in civic engagement and become a good citizen. I mean, you're never going to bat 100%, but at the end of the day, yes, when you challenge people head on and they see you believe in it, and you're not paid as an insider, and you're somebody who believes in it because we stand for truth and justice, then, they can see that you're...
trust.
it's so about trust. And like the gentleman was saying, that at the end of the day, there's a lot of distrust, because the closer you get to coming on programs like this, the more people doubt, you know, that you're trustworthy. So it's a catch-22 for people like myself.
What does work, do you think, Mubi?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, we have to have a proper understanding of this issue. You know, the Canadians, we just started our research network on terrorism, security, and society. But with respect to de-radicalization, there's de-radicalization, which is a cognitive shift, and then there's what is called disengagement, which is a behavioral shift. There are about 15 countries that are doing de-radicalization programs.
Are we one of them?
We are not one of them, unfortunately.
Should we be?
We definitely should be. We do have, between, I mean, the three of us, we could come up with a de-radicalization program.
So why don't we?
I'm not kidding. We could do it in 15 minutes.
Would you like to see that, Ray?
Absolutely. No, I think we'll have to have something that involves all those estates, all those different elements of society.
Well, after what's happened now, will it happen?
I think it'll come. Like everything else, things shift. We've seen a tremendous transformation of our society since 2011, and we're going to see some more happen. So ultimately, though, it has to be at the root level. People in the community must be engaged and aware of those who are falling prey to radicalization.
Well, if Canadians weren't focused on homegrown terror before this year, they certainly are. Thank you, all of you, for your perspective. Yes. We will be back in a moment with this story.
When night falls here, it gets very dangerous.
Sasha Petrusik looks at divided loyalties in Lebanon as Syria's bloody conflict seeps over the border. That's next on The National.